Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks. And this week, the Les Paul Standard, the Burst. Is it really worth the hype? Now, in the last few years, there's been very little left unsaid about those Les Paul standards produced between 1958 and 1960. It's a topic that's been covered ad nauseum in magazine articles, forum posts, and, guilty as charged, YouTube videos. Yet, on a clinic tour I've just finished with Line 6 and Yamaha, there's nary a Q&A section at the end of the show which has gone by where someone hasn't stuck their hand up and asked the question, what's a 1959 Les Paul really like to play? Which got me thinking that for all of the magazine articles and forum posts and YouTube videos, one thing that gets a little bit lost in the melee of opinion, cultural, historical significance, construction, value, etc., is what they actually like to play as guitars. When an instrument, or anything actually, takes on such epic, kind of mythological proportions, it becomes very hard to judge it exclusively for what it is without being overawed by the sense of the occasion or the magnitude or the enormity of playing something that is probably worth more than your average house. Over the last few years, I've been very fortunate to play quite a few bursts. I've not really been keeping track, but trying to work it out earlier, I guess it's around 15 or 16, which, as much as that's probably 1% of those guitars which were produced in those 3 years, is still quite a fair few and gives me a somewhat unique perspective in terms of being someone who, if we're honest, probably is never going to be able to afford one of these guitars, so isn't likely to be skewed by the confirmation bias of just having spent six figures on a guitar before being asked to express an opinion on it, but still knows a fair amount about them and has played quite a few. As they say, I haven't really got a horse in the race, but still know a fair bit about them. Les Pauls, not horses. As I said, there's been very little left unsaid about bursts in recent years, so I'll try not to prattle on too much in this part of the video, but before we delve into what they are truly like as guitars, it's worth at least a very cursory understanding of why these guitars cost so bloody much. Like these two examples currently for sale at ATB Guitars in Cheltenham in the UK, each for sale for £300,000 each, about $370,000 at the time of writing. That's just shy of $750,000 for two guitars, which by any stretch of the imagination is a very, very large amount of money. But as with any item that reaches such giddying financial heights, you're not paying for the item itself. You're not getting £300,000 worth of guitar, much the same as you're not getting $70 million worth of Ferrari. If you bought a 250 GT short wheelbase from 1961, you're paying for the historical and cultural significance. In the case of a burst, you're also paying for the scarcity. As the old saying goes, 1,500 remain and only 2,000 remain. Of course, there have been a fair number of fakes over the years, which again only adds weight and real value to those original guitars. It's worth remembering that at the time they were a commercial flop, hence Gibson shifting focus to the SG so quickly by late 1961. So what happened? It's hard to really put a finger on the crux of the burst's success, but it is easy enough to pinpoint its genesis. Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Mike Bloomfield and Peter Green. Suffice to say the mid-60s were a very good time for the burst, despite actually having been out of production for about 5 or 6 years at this point. Eric Clapton would literally write the Blues Rock Handbook with John Mayall on the Blues Breakers, while Keith Richards would literally write rock history with Satisfaction, both armed with a burst. By the 70s, Jimmy Page would switch his 59 Telecaster for a 59 Les Paul, while both Paul Kossoff and Billy Gibbons were both discovering the beauty of the burst. By the 80s and the 90s, both Gary Moore and Slash, to name but two, were putting original Sunburst Les Pauls to incredible use, and as such, the cultural and historical impact of these guitars is near enough impossible to overstate. So much of the music that we love and know was written, recorded, and performed live on these guitars, which, coupled with their scarcity, kind of get some way towards understanding why you have some of the most valuable guitars in existence. I'm going home. So, all of that said, what do they sound like? I guess if you're spending 300 grand on a guitar, you probably want one that sounds half decent. Now, the good news is, of all the bursts that I've played, pretty much all of them, without the exception, have in some way, shape or form sounded very, very good. And I think a huge part of that equation is undoubtedly the pickups. Crucially, something people don't really speak about all that frequently, the electronics. Now, my experience of a Les Paul Standard growing up was my 2001 model, which, retrospectively, didn't really appreciate it at the time, was a very dark and mid-rangey sounding guitar. So you can imagine my surprise upon first plugging in a burst, all of this top end and articulation and clarity and just treble responsiveness that I didn't really associate with a Les Paul. And as much as a good set of PAF replicas got my Les Paul Standards kind of 50% of the way there, the deciding factor was undoubtedly the value of the potentiometers. I've done a video on this in the past, but to cut a long story short, those bursts use 500k pots, which essentially will yield a brighter sounding electric tone. By comparison, my 2001 Standard, when I removed the pots that should have read 250k, actually were reading about 220k. Which goes a long way towards explaining why that guitar in particular was such a dark, mid-rangey, kind of muddy sounding Les Paul, at least in some settings. Guitars that were predominantly produced in the 1950s, it's probably a little surprise to learn that those bursts came with something that we now think of and refer to as 50s wiring. I'm not going to boggle you with the science, but this essentially refers to how the tone cap is wired to the guitar, meaning that when you roll the volume back, the pickup tone stays consistent. It doesn't get darker or muddier. Again, giving you a tonal and dynamic responsiveness that you won't necessarily find in more modern day Les Pauls. Now, of course, all of that is relatively easily remedied by a little bit of soldering know-how. But, of course, a massive part of that original burst tone is those PAF, patent applied for, humbucking pickups, introduced and designed by Seth Lover in 1957. Now, an original set of PAFs will set you back the better part of 10 to 15 grand, but thankfully there are any number of incredible pickup makers out there making very good replicas. But the kind of magic and myth and majesty of an original set of PAFs probably be a video series unto itself, so I'm not really going to get into that, but suffice to say, all of the above kind of combined, I think really is absolutely integral to the fundamental sound of a burst. Now, in regards to playability, I guess this is where things can be a little bit more inconsistent. Yes, I've played one or two bursts that probably would have benefited from a little bit of love and a little bit of a setup, but outside of that, neck profile is going to be the main kind of inconsistency, or not inconsistency so much as difference on Les Paul Standards. In 1958, it was a bigger neck carve, although not quite as big as some of the reissues would have you believe, in my experience, with a smaller fret wire, whereas in 1959, Gibson slimmed the neck profile to a slightly more cultured carve, which at least for me is my favourite. Thanks kind of in part to poor sales then, in 1960, the neck profile was slimmed again to a more blade-like profile. You can see the difference in these neck profiles on these two guitars currently for sale at ATB, although bizarrely, they both are still examples from 1960, although one being what we term as a double O, essentially an early 1960 model built to 59 specs. For me personally, can't beat the feel of a good 59 neck profile. Just fits beautifully in my hand and feels like Gibson really hit their kind of stride at that particular moment in time. Whereas a 60 neck, I just find a little bit too slim for my preferences. But again, that is entirely personal preference and would no doubt vary from player to player. But in regard to kind of physical attributes of the guitar, it's definitely worth keeping an eye on neck profiles because they do vary significantly from year to year. Now, while we're talking physical attributes, it's worth mentioning that in my experience, and of course this will be a little bit of a generalization because I've not played all 15 or so 100 of them, bursts tend to be on the lighter side of life, coming in at the kind of mid to maybe late £8 range. Of course, there are exceptions to that. One of those currently for sale at ATB is comfortably into the £9. But the reason for which they were, generally speaking, a little bit lighter, possibly old growth mahogany, don't shoot the messenger, and what effect that had on their tone, again, is an entirely different can of worms. And last but not least, their physical appearance. Burst examples from mid-1960 onwards will likely look very different from their earlier counterparts, primarily due to the different die composition that Gibson were using in response to dealer criticism that the Les Pauls was simply fading very prominently in shop windows. Ed King's Red Eye, of course now owned by Jason Isbell, being a great example of a guitar that faded in a shop window, save for the one spot that was covered by the dealer hang tag, hanging from the pickup selector. Of course, these varying levels of fade now comprise Gibson's multitude of colour options that they offer on Les Pauls, but at the time, this was seen as a fundamental flaw, and thus from 1960 onwards, or mid-1960 onwards, you get what are referred to as the tomato soup or clown bursts, basically guitars that didn't fade, thanks to a different composition of the die. You can see that on this guitar, taken from mid-1960, referred to as Dante, that was available at ATB Guitars earlier this year, of course having retained not only its incredible top, but very vivid shade of red. Now for me personally, I don't like the appearance of these guitars as much as the guitars which faded, but again, that is entirely personal preference. So what's the consensus? Are they worth the hype? Now, I guess at this point it is nigh on impossible to disentangle a burst's financial value from its actual value as an instrument and nothing else. But what I would say, in my experience, is that they're pretty much like any other guitar in terms of there being good examples, there being amazing examples, and there being some not so good examples. The obvious caveat being, never played a bad one. And we've all played guitars that have left us underwhelmed and thinking you probably would have been better served as a railway sleeper. But for whatever reason, I've never played a burst that's left me totally disappointed. My suspicion being that Gibson just hit their stride. They had a perfect storm moment between 58 and 60, a few years into Les Paul production where they'd ironed out the kinks that had plagued them earlier on with neck angle issues or different tail pieces. Had a glut of amazing materials available at their disposal for a brief period in time, as well as being a year into production of about as close to a perfect pickup design as you will ever find in Seth Lover's PAF. Couple that with the analyte dies that inadvertently would create one of rock's most iconic looks, with those guitars that would just fade over time, and you really do have a perfect storm moment that, for whatever reason, has never been repeated. Factor in their cultural and historical significance, and everyone who's played and put one to incredible effect over the years, and I guess it's no surprise that they are consistently among the most valuable guitars on earth. Now I'm going to play you out with this mid-1960 example that I showed you earlier, but as ever, I'm Chris Buck, this is Friday Fretworks. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers guys, take care, see you soon.